There's a lag between when an expense is saved to iCloud and it is available to us in a query. And this creates a problem that when we create an expense and we come back to the table view, that expense doesn't appear. In this video, we're going to demonstrate the problem and show how to solve it using delegation.
So bringing up the application and creating a new expense. Let's create a iPhone 10 expense. Oop, a little too expensive. And let's click Save. Notice how in the console it still says record was saved, but even though we are querying right when the view will appear, it does not actually show up.
And if we hit the plus and just come back, we can see that because some time has passed, we can query and now it's there. So what we're going to need to do is create a mechanism whereby when the new record is saved, we can pass that new record back to the table view controller and have it put it in the records array.
So let's begin by creating a new Swift file. And we're just going to select a blank Swift file. Click Next. And let's call this expenses delegate. And click Create. And inside this file, we are actually going to create a new delegate protocol. So let's start by creating a new protocol. And let's call this expenses delegate. And create a new function requirement, func add records. And this is actually going to be of type CK record. But before we can use the type CK record, we actually have to import CloudKit. Once we have imported CloudKit, we can now access CK record. And so records is going to be of that type.
So what we're doing is we're saying that any object that follows this protocol will have this add method.
Exactly. So let's go to expenses view controller and let's actually conform to this protocol. So I'm going to go navigate to the bottom of the page and create a new extension for our expenses view controller. And let's conform this to the expenses delegate. Since we're conforming to that delegate, we have to implement a new function called add records and handle the case when this function might be called. So this function will be called whenever there are new records that we have to hold in our local array of records. So let's access our array of records, our local array of records, and simply append the new records to it. Once we do this, we then have to update our view if it exists. Dale, do you want to add anything to that?
So we, in this example, are going to be going to a view controller where the user enters a new expense, and then we're coming back here, which means when we are accessing this through this method, calling add on this view controller, the table view will still exist. But there are times when we call a delegate that UI elements may or may not exist, so we ought to check to see if, for example, the table view exists before we call reload data on it.
So let's use an if let statement. Let's say if let table view equals self.expenses table view. And if that table view exists, let's reload its data. This can actually be shortened into a single line of code by doing self.expenses table view and using optional chaining to reload its data.
So this is saying reload data will only get called on expenses table view if it exists.
Exactly. So now that we've done that, let's modify our code a little bit in this expenses view controller by simply deleting the view will appear. Right now, the view will appear simply queries expenses every time the view will appear. This is a downside because A, you've seen the lag, and B, we're overwhelmingly querying CloudKit more than we actually need to. So we're going to get rid of the view will appear function, and in the view did load, we will call query expenses.
So when the app launches, we create this initial view controller with the table view. We'll get the expenses from CloudKit and stick them in the array of records. And then after that, the goal is that we will add new records to the array as we create them.
Exactly. So let's navigate to our single expense view controller and let's create a new property. So this property is going to be a var expense delegate, expenses delegate of type expenses delegate optional. So right now, as the way we have it, a memory leak can occur. The way a memory leak will occur though is if we set an object to this expenses delegate, that object might actually stay in memory longer than we've intended it to. So to solve this problem, we need to go to expenses delegate and change protocol expenses delegate to expenses delegate class. What this is saying is that the only thing that can conform to this protocol is a class. That gives us the ability in our single expense view controller to say weak var. Dale, what does that weak mean?
It means that in the reference counting, this will not add to the reference count, so it doesn't hang on to the object. If other parts of the system get rid of this object, then it won't be here anymore.
Exactly. So now that we have our delegate, and it's sure not to cause a memory leak, let's go down to our save expense function, and inside of our modify records completion block, let's create an if let. Because saved records is right now an optional, and we need to make sure saved records actually exist if we want to pass records back. So if let saved records equals saved records, then we're going to access our delegate, our expenses delegate, and access its add function and pass it the new saved records. With this, we are saying that we have new delegates, new records, and we're telling the delegate, hey, add these to whatever way you're managing records.
So the previous view controller is our delegate. It's the object that has the add method, and we are telling it, hey, add this new record to the array of records.
Yep. So now that we have both a single expense view controller with a property of delegate, and we're actually conforming to the expenses delegate, we need to tell the single expense view controller that we are its expenses delegate. So right below our query expenses function, let's create a new function. We're going to override the prepare for segue function. In this function, we need to make sure our destination is of type single expense view controller. And we can do that using a guard let statement. So guard let destination equals segue dot destination, and we're going to optionally cast this as a single expense view controller. Else, we're simply going to return. Now that we are guaranteed that our destination view controller is of type single expense view controller, let's access our destination and access its expenses delegate and tell it that our class right now conforms to that delegate by saying self. Now that we've done that, we can actually build and run our application. And demonstrating it works, let's add a new expense of Steve Jobs' house. And let's say it's a lot of money. And let's click save. Notice Steve Jobs' house appears now in our table view without us needing to make a separate CloudKit call to query for that record.
So now let's just walk how this delegation works again. So first off, we have a file we created that defines our delegate in it. And this is a protocol that says any class that follows this protocol is going to have an add function that receives an array of CK records. The place where we are managing our array of records is in our expenses view controller. This needs to be notified anytime there is a new record to add to the array of records. So we said that the expenses view controller is going to follow the expenses delegate and have this add function. So this add function is going to receive an array of records and it's going to append them to the existing records. And if the table view exists, it's going to reload the data so that we see that new expense. Now, this is the object that needs to be told when there are new records. So when we do a segue, that is from the view controller with the table view to the view controller that has the form in it, we need to tell the view controller with the form in it, that is the destination of our segue, that this object, self, is going to be the expenses delegate, the one that has the add function on it. So the expenses or single expense view controller has a property on it, expenses delegate, where we've registered the delegate, that is this previous view controller, as the one that has the add function on it. And again, we make this weak so that it doesn't unnecessarily hang on to the other view controller. And at the point at which we have saved the record, so we tell CloudKit, hey, save this, and it does save it, and we know that there's going to be a lag if we go query for that. We say, okay, well, we have the record. We can just take that record, which is among the saved records, and add it to the existing records so that when we go back to, pop back to the previous view controller, the one with the table view, it will have an array with the collection of appropriate records, and it will have already reloaded the table view and will, as soon as we get back there, display the items in the table view.